Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeff Badnock, and on behalf of our organizing committee, the Alumni Association staff that's worked very hard on this project, and our lecturers, it gives me great pleasure to invite you to the 20th Annual Alumni Association Community Lecture Series. This series was developed over 20 years ago to deepen the University of Montana and community ties by showcasing UM faculty and the very interesting research that they're involved in. This series of talks is generally set around a central theme. Among the people who worked on this series in the past, who actually formed it, Ann Boone and Kitty Robbins, Don Hobby, and of course Dean Chris Comer, have also lent their efforts to both imagining and developing this series. Past lecture series topics have been the brain, Russia, hidden treasures of Montana, birds, twice, and water. As always, each lecture concludes with a Q&A series with our lecturers. So if you hear something that prompts a question in your mind, hold on to it, and when the lecture is over, we'll give you an opportunity to ask your question. We'll have microphones, we'll take them out into the audience. The lectures are being filmed by MCAT under a media assistance grant to our lecture series. So we want to make sure that the microphones are there to capture what it is you're asking about. Does anyone need to be reminded about silencing their phone? Okay, silence your phone if you haven't already. As an alum, I take great pride in our university and the richness Missoula enjoys by the university sharing this valley with us. These lectures are meant to bring the university's mission as expressed in its motto, Lux et Veritas, light and truth, to us, the public, in an interesting and a beneficial way. That could not be a better segue into introducing this year's lecture series topic, Beyond the Headlines, Clearing the Air with Real Evidence. In this year's series, the planners covered two topics of great interest to Montanans. The first three lectures will cover aspects of wildfire. Anyone in Montana who lived through the summer of 2017 has stories to tell about how even in our cities and towns, people in Montana were affected by wildfire. But there are deeper understandings to be had about wildfire, how to manage it, how it shapes both our history and our future, and how it affects us physically that will be discussed here in the coming weeks. The fourth and fifth lectures will take up with topics related to criminal law and juvenile justice, and will test what you think you know about them with fact-based research and experience from both the legal and sociological aspects. Finally, our sixth and final evening will convene a panel of UM faculty that will do what university professors do best, help us to be discerning and critical thinkers. What do we really know? What evidence shapes what we know? How do we trust that evidence? To begin the 2018 Community Lecture Series, Professors Andrew Larson and Anna Sala will speak to us on the inevitability of wildfires, fire ecology, and forest management. Please join me in welcoming Anna Sala, University of Montana professor.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak here. I'm very passionate about the work that I do, and I love explaining it to my parents, my siblings, my family, and friends that are not biologists or ecologists. So today, it's really a wonderful opportunity to tell the community, to Missoula, what we are doing, what we're thinking about. So thank you for being here. I think everybody or most of you had experienced this last summer. It was a tremendous fire season. The smoke of the fires created a lot of health problems, not to mention sadness and suffocation. And the fires, of course, created a lot of destruction, home destruction, and there was tragedy too, some lives lost. And so this happened because we live in an environment, we were surrounded by fires. And the reason is because we live in an environment that is fire prone. And when it gets hot, it's bound to burn. Oops. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. So we were surrounded by fires, and what I was saying, we do live in a fire-prone environment, and when it gets hot, it burns. The forest dries, and it burns. And so the issue is that we do have to get used to it. So all indications are that it's going to get warmer, and this is what this figure, I don't know how to do this, to look away, and is there any way that I can take this out? Ha. Okay, now I'm free. So this is what this figure at the top shows. This is over time, whether years have been cooler in blue or warmer in red than the average. And what we see is that starting in the 80s, we have consecutive years that have been warmer than the average, and the different colors are different measures. So it is getting hotter, and the indication is that it will continue to get hotter. And the laundry dries faster when it's hotter, so does the forest. And so there's going to be more fire, which is what this graph below shows. The red bars are the number of fires in Forest Service land. And we see, again, that starting in the 80s, the number of fires has increased, and so has the area of forest burn. And this is the temperature. The black line is the temperature, the mean temperature in spring and summer. So it is getting hotter, and hotter weather brings fires, and we live in a fire-prone environment. So, of course, this brings sometimes some sense of devastation. So the areas that, the areas that we are used to hike that are usually lush look like this, and that to some people is sort of brings again a sense of devastation. But to those of us that study forests and study the ecology, it also brings a sense of joy, and not obviously not any joy for the property destruction and the lives lost and the health problems, but joy for the forest. And this is because fire is good to the forest itself. We might like it or not, but it's good for the forest, okay? It's a natural disturbance. It has occurred since the beginning of times. These western forests that we live in are adapted to fire, so they are used to fire. To the forest, fire has many benefits, and it's a disturbance, and as any disturbance, it creates change, and the change provides opportunities. And an example, for instance, sadly enough, are wars. A lot of progress is made during and after wars. So fire, for instance, promotes biodiversity because it changes, and that change promotes some species to come in, and over time they are replaced by other species. And if this fire keeps occurring, this pool of different species that do different things over time persists, and they are a buffer to environmental change. So it's good to keep diversity. However, not all fires are equal. Different forests are experienced or are adapted to different fire regimes. And these fire regimes change over spatial scales. So on the one end, we have the frequent low-severity fire regime, which occurs in dry ponderosa pine forests. And in these systems, fire was frequent, occur anywhere from 12 to 30 years, sometimes a little bit more. And because of the frequency, there was no time for a forest to regrow in between fires. And so these fires were surface fires that did not kill the dominant trees. At the most, they would scar them, but these trees would survive. And so the end result, if this fire keeps occurring frequently, is that little trees that start growing cannot continue growing. They are killed. And so the end result is these open stands. And this is a cross-section of a tree from the center of the tree throughout the scar to the exterior of the tree. And we can see here that since very early in the life of this tree, there's constant fire scars. So this is how we know the frequency of fire. You'll notice that these fire scars stop at some point. And this coincides, this year here is exactly the beginning of the 1900s when we started suppressing fires. So there are no more fire scars in these last 100 years. So at the other extreme from this frequent low severity fire, we have the high severity fire that is very infrequent. And this is more common in higher elevation forests, subalpine forests. And in these forests, fires burn anywhere from 100 to 300 years or more. So there was a lot of time between fires, which means that the forest could grow, fuel, biomass could accumulate, and so when this ignites, then the whole forest is burned to the ground. But these forests are adapted to it, and this is a picture from the Yellowstone fires 10 years after the fire, so they are adapted to it, and they regrow. And in between these extremes, the frequent low-severity fire and the infrequent high-severity fires, we have what we call the mixed fire regime, which actually it includes a lot of different things, but it's a mosaic in the landscape that varies over space and time, where we have some stands that for some time are subjected to frequent fire, but then at some point they might experience a high severity fire that might be a canopy fire. So there is a big mosaic. And so what's something that it's important to keep in mind is that this low severity fire regime is actually the least abundant in the landscape, okay? But this is the one that we live closest to. So it's the one that matters to us more. But it's the least abundant. Probably the most abundant is this mixed fire regime, okay? So the end result is that we have different type of forests that across the landscape that are that have different fire regimes, and each one of them benefits from these fire regimes. So there is some species, for instance, and this is an example. Some species need fire. And the black-backed woodpecker is an example that was brought to us by Dick Hutto, now a retired emeritus professor, and they counted the number of occurrences of this particular species at places where there was no fire. A little bit of fire killed about up to 20% of the trees, 40 up to a fire that killed the entire canopy, 100% of the trees. And it's obvious that the bird, the black-backed woodpecker, prefers and needs forests that have burned. And why is that? Because when the fire kills the trees, there's still food left in the tree, and a lot of bugs make their home there. They deposit their eggs, the larvae grow, and the black-backed woodpecker has adapted to now feed on these larvae. So it does need burned trees, okay? This is one example. There is many other examples of birds that do require and benefit from fire. So these benefits from fire, we're not used to hear about them in the media, but luckily this is an example in the New York Times that did portray that the black bag woodpecker does benefit from fire. And sometimes it's important for us to be reminded there are benefits of fire, okay? Another important adaptation to disturbance in general and fire in particular is resprouting. Many plants have underground organs that store a lot of food. They are not quite potatoes, but similar to potatoes. They do store a lot of starch, and they use that starch when fire comes and kills all the above ground. They have a good head start to resprout vigorously, take advantage of the conditions after fire. This case is a manzanita cousin in the chaparral, but around here we have lots of species. The nicknick is one. The bear grass also has underground rhizomes and can resprout. And some plants even flower profusely after fire because fire releases some nutrients in the ashes, and some plants are adapted to take advantage of that pulse and flower. Another important strategy is in low severity, high frequency fires, so forests that do burn frequently, is to have a very thick bark. And this is the case of ponderosa pine, and that's why we call it a fire-resistant species. So this thick bark insulates the tree from the heat of the fire. Sometimes they do get scarred, and the frequent fire will keep opening the scar and make this, what we call this cat face. But the tree survives, and many other trees are not even scarred. In contrast to ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, for instance, subalpine fir, lodgepole pine, those have thin barks, and those are fire sensitive. So they do not tolerate even this low intensity fire, and they are killed. And that's why their growth is limited when there is frequent fire. Another strategy is what we call serotiny, and this one happens in high severity fires. And it's a strategy where the seeds are not released unless there is fire. So they need the heat to release the seeds. And some lodgepole pine varieties are serotinous, meaning they will not open their cones, so they keep their cones closed, and they will not open until there is fire. Then they release the seeds, and that's why we see such a regrowth, regeneration after fire, okay? Other species produce seeds, and these seeds remain dormant in the soil. They won't germinate unless they sense the chemicals of the smoke in the fire. So these seeds here, as unimpressive as they are the babies for the plants, right? There's embryos, so those are the babies. And we don't put the babies at the mercy of the elements. These seeds are programmed to know exactly how cold it has been, how long it has been cold, meaning a winter went past, how warm has it been, for how long, meaning the spring is coming, and some, in addition, are adapted to sense the chemicals of the smoke to stimulate germination. So that's another adaptation to fire. So fire is not the only disturbance. There's many disturbances around here, and we are also very aware of the bark beetle, the mountain pine beetle, and the tremendous outbreaks that has caused. And so I'll talk a little bit about the beetle, but then I'll link it to fire. So how pines defend themselves against the beetles is by making resin, and this resin pitches out the beetle, encapsulates it, and sometimes the resin has chemical compounds that also help kill the beetle. Mass attacks, and then the trees are killed, occur when lots of beetles attack the tree and overwhelm the tree defenses, and then subsequent beetles come, and the tree doesn't have enough defenses, and then it's when they start coming and killing the tree. The resin is produced by what we call these resin canals, and this is a chunk of the wood, and the tree has resin canals that are vertical, but it also has radial resin canals. And these resin canals are actually, these are the radial and vertical. They are all interconnected. They are all full of resin, and those are the ones that will expel the resin when the beetle starts munching on the tree. And we can see this is a cross-section of the wood. These are the annual rings. And we can see these light spots here. These are the resin canals. So we can count how many resin canals the tree has. And up to 10 years of resin canals remain effective. Okay, so they are interconnected, and they remain effective. And so what we first did is, okay, does it matter, the resin canals? Is it really an effective defense? And my graduate student at the time, Sharon Hood, who is now in the Forest Service as a scientist there, what she did is she compared trees that were attacked but survived, so that they defended themselves against the beetle, and paired with trees that were attacked but did not survive. And what she found is that the trees that did survive the attack had a lot more resin canals. So that tells us that, yes, these resin canals or resin ducts are effective defenses against the mountain pine beetle. This is in ponderosa pine, okay? So now I'm going to link this to fire. And it turns out that low severity fire, this is the type of fire that doesn't kill the trees, the dominant trees. It actually bumps up the defenses. It causes that heat causes trees to make more defenses, okay, to make more resin canals. And what Sharon did was to compare trees in two adjacent stands, one that had not burned and the other had burned. And she did that at two sites, here in Montana at Blue Mountain, and at a site at Utah. And then she counted the resin canals in both type of stands before the fire occurred in one of them, right? And then after the fire. So in the trees in the two type of stands, that was before the fire. None of them had seen the fire yet, had the same amount of resin canals, and that happened at both sites. However, once the fire occurred, the trees that were in the frequently burned, or the trees that were in the stand that had burned, increase the number of resin canals, increase the number of defenses. And that happened again at the Utah site. So this heat is actually causing the tree to bump up defenses. And why is that important? Well, because beetles might come after a fire, and trees sometimes do get a little bit shaken up by the heat of the fire, so they do get some stress, and so then they would be more susceptible to beetles. And one of the responses is, given that I'm going to be shaken up and the chances are that beetles are going to come, I'm going to use that cue, which is the heat, to bump up the defenses, okay? So, and we have also shown that in stands that have been fire suppressed, there has been over time a decrease in defenses, okay? So, other ecosystem benefits with Tom DeLuca, now the dean of the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation, we did a project that we were interested in knowing, okay, what are the effects of fire? So we decided to go to roadless and wilderness areas where there other factors, management, logging, had been minimized, so that we could focus just on the consequences of fire. Okay, so we went to these places here in red dots. We had, I think, 8 or 9 sites. And at each site, so you can see that that involved a lot of walking. And I was always behind Tom. And one day, we had walked what seemed to me like 50 miles. Probably was about 14. But that was after 2 days of bush walking in the heat. So I was tired. So, of course, I was behind him. And we were walking to this airstrip where a small airplane was supposed to pick us up. Well, did pick us up, okay? But anyway, I get there just dead. I had enough of heat and walking and charcoal and everything. And I get there, and Tom looks at me and he says, I'm going to run to check out one more site. And I thought he was just joking. And he started running, and I was left behind feeling guilty for not optimizing my funds of going running to another site. But anyway, at each site we did select a stand that had been frequently burned and a stand that had not experienced fire for about 100 years. Okay, you can see that this one is a lot more overgrown, and I have to say that those stands were absolutely beautiful. These trees up to 700 years old, really, really beautiful. So there were lots of results from this project, but one important result, we sampled the soils from the two stands, and then we measured the ability to release nitrogen, okay? And in the stand that wasn't burned and the stand that had experienced frequent fire. So this is for the different sites, but the important thing here is the mean of all sites. The sites that had been burning frequently, that had experienced fire, had a higher ability to release nitrogen. And so you know that nitrogen is important. If you are into gardening, that's the first thing that it's in organic fertilizers, in artificial fertilizers. Nitrogen is very important. What is relevant here also is that in the frequently burned stands, the fire had not occurred last year or 2 years before. The last fire was about 20 years. So this is a long-lasting effect of frequent fire, more nitrogen. And these forests are nitrogen limited. And then at the time, we did some experiments, and Tom has done more. We know that in part this effect is due to the charcoal of fire that helps to release nitrogen. Okay? So one thing that is, I think, obvious to everybody is that the stands that have not experienced fire for 100 years are a lot more dense. There is a lot more trees than the stands that have experienced repeated burning. Again, those surface fire kill the small trees. And this graph just shows this. This is the density number of trees per hectare in these unburned and the burned stands. And we have it by species: ponderosa, Douglas fir, grand fir, and then the total. So you can see that being the total amount of density almost doubles. So if we don't have fire, the density will increase. But also that this increase in density is due to this Douglas fir and grand fir mostly, okay, that proliferate when the stand is not burned. And so these are these trees. These trees are more shade tolerant. Those are the fire sensitive that are killed by frequent fires. So when frequent fire is not there, they do grow, okay? So, okay, turns out that we live in a dry environment, particularly in the summer, and trees use a lot of water. And so this, what looks here like a diaper, underneath we actually have these probes that allow us to measure how much water is flowing through the tree. So we've measured number of species in the summer, and about 30 to 60 gallons per day per tree in July. Okay, so that seems like a lot, but for other oaks, they can get up to 300 gallons. Okay, these are probably underestimates, but it's a lot of water. So last night I did a little bit of back of the envelope type of calculation, and I assume, okay, let's assume in 1 month, July, in a football field. So that gives you an idea of the area. If we put 200 trees, and this would be equivalent to the density of these fire-maintained stands, okay? So how much water would that mean? Well, up to 31 trucks, big trucks, the 11,000-gallon type of trucks of water. That's a lot, okay? Now double that density, which is what happens when we don't have fire. Well, we get to 32 trucks of water. That's a lot of water that trees use, okay? So what that means is that if it doesn't rain, which it usually doesn't rain much in July, those denser stands are going to get drier and are going to get crispier and ready for fire. And We have, in fact, measured that because it's important to measure things and know that, yes, they are happening how we think they're happening. We have instruments to measure how wet or dry the plant is, okay? And this was at the Lick Creek Research Demonstration Area where the Forest Service had done some fuel reduction treatment. So we had plots that where the stand had been fire suppressed, very dense, and nothing was done to it. And then we had other plots where different treatments were implemented. All treatments involved thinning, and some, in addition, had to prescribe fire either in the spring or in the fall. So the black bars here are the denser stands, and these are the different treatments, the lighter bars, okay? So, okay, June. That year, that was in, I think, 2002. That year, I think there was some spring precipitation. So in June, all trees in the different treatments have about the same amount of water. So they are equally wet or dry, just in between, okay? So it doesn't matter the density. If there is water available, they get it. But come July, and the trees in the denser stand were significantly drier than the trees in any of the other treatments. So again, what that means is the trees, the needles are getting drier, and that makes, of course, better fuels. When these trees get drier, a consequence is that they make less food via photosynthesis, and that's the carbohydrates that they make. Those are the ones that they use then for growing, which we also measured. And since at the end of June, the trees in the denser stands, which are the black dots, have lower photosynthesis rates, meaning they are making less food than the trees in all the other stands. So they are stressed, they are not making enough food, and therefore they grow less. So these trees in the denser stands grow less than the trees in any other stand. So the denser strands, trees get stressed out. We also have done measurements at the Lubric Experimental Forest, where a project called the Fire Surrogates was actually a national project where there's different treatments that have been implemented. So we went at Lubric, also my graduate student Sharon at the time, and they implemented 4 treatments. One was they left the stand that had been fire suppressed, so it was dense, untouched, and then 3 more treatments. One was a light prescribed burn that didn't kill the trees because it was an understory. So the stand remained dense. And so these are these 2 treatments. The stand remained dense. And the other 2 treatments were both thin, so reduced the amount of trees. And in one was just the thinning, in the other was a thinning with a little of prescribed burning, okay? But effectively, we have 2 types of stands, dense and thin, okay? The treatments were implemented at this time indicated by the arrow, and you can see that as soon as we thinned, or they thinned, the trees start growing a lot more, which is what I've shown you before. If you thin the trees, there's more food, more water, and they grow more. But it's also important or interesting that the thin stands produce a lot more resin ducts and a lot more defenses. So not only they are growing more, but they are better defended, okay? And so then the bark beetle outbreak came, and the trees that were in these dense stands suffer a lot more mortality, much higher percent of dead trees in these dense stands than in the thin stands. Now, I want to make clear that this is not only because these trees in the thin stand are more defended, but also because they are farther apart, and being farther apart makes it harder for the beetle to work cooperatively, okay? Okay, so I've given you perhaps the idea that fire exclusion has increased, well, I've shown you that has increased stand density. The denser stands are more prone to drought and insects. And so the tempting solution is reduce fuels by logging, right? And that's the conclusion that the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal came this last summer. In September. Forest Service policies have contributed to a fuels buildup for more than a century. This is in part true. But Bill Clinton turbocharged the mismanagement in the 90s when he sharply reduced logging and road building in federal forests. This has led disease and insect infestations run rampant, and fire proliferation is one result. And this is the type of media coverage where knowledge is important, where critical thinking is important. Because if you don't know anything about it, this makes a lot of sense, right? So I have shown you, yes, that with fire exclusion, there is an increase in stand density, and that brings problem, okay? And however, what we need to keep in mind, and that this effect of fuel buildup is strongest in the type of forest that experience these frequent low severity fires. And this is actually the least abundant in the landscape. So this effect, yes, it has occurred, and in general, there's been an increase in fuels. There is no question, but it's the strongest in a relatively small fraction of the landscape. Okay? And then we have to ask the question, why are fires occurring? Well, climate, they occur when it's warm and dry. Okay, so that's a primary driver. Also because of fuel accumulation, there's been some fuel accumulation, no doubt about it. And some people also suggest that the encroachment into the areas between where we live and the backcountry, which we call the wildland-urban interface, has also contributed to the increase in fires. I'm not sure to what extent that's true in Montana. It's true in California and in other states. Not sure about Montana, so that's why I put it a little bit below. Although there is no question that this encroachment has increased enormously the cost of firefighting, okay? Okay, so what would logging do? Logging would do really nothing to climate, and if we log too much, actually, it might be counterproductive. It might even get warmer because trees absorb the CO2 from the atmosphere by growing, and so we don't want to remove too many trees. We can do something about fuel accumulation, but whether we call it logging or not, that's something else. We need to do fuel reductions. And I think that's very different than logging, because logging, if it's for commercial purposes, we want to target the big trees. And the big trees are the ones that we want to leave. What we need to do to reduce fuels is remove the smaller trees, okay? So, in fact, our research has shown that past logging activities, and that I'm referring to the past, okay, since the 1900s and the clear cutting, etc., up to the 70s, past logging activities have contributed substantially to fuel accumulation. And this is what I'm showing in this figure. Again, this is the density, and we're going to focus on the hatch bars, which is the total, okay? And so we compare, first I'm going to focus in these two, we compare two types of stands. The one in the wilderness areas that had experienced frequent fire, but no logging in the past. Those are in wilderness areas. And we compare them to stands that had not experienced fire, but also had no logging because they were in wilderness areas. So the only difference between these two stands is whether or not there has been fire. And so the comparison of these two stands tell us what the lack of fire has done in terms of density. It has roughly doubled. So if we don't have fire, the density doubles. But then we compare to a third group of stands. We're going to compare these two. None of those have experienced fire, so they've been not subjected to any fire since approximately 100 years. And the only difference is that one type of stands did not have any logging in the past, while the others had logging in the past. So that measures only the effect of logging. And look what happened. The effect of logging is equal or greater than the effect of not having fire. So that tells us that we have to be very, very careful in how are we going to implement these fuel reduction treatments. It's not a matter of the traditional logging. And of course, some type of logging will need to occur because we need to pay for the cost of fuel management. But the bottom line is that fuel reductions must be very strategic and need to be maintained. If we go in the forest and log, we're creating disturbance, we're creating openings, we're creating opportunities for trees to grow. If we don't come back, these trees will grow and fuels will accumulate. So the fuel reduction do need to be very strategic and need to be maintained. And Andrew will talk about this. So I hope I've convinced you that expect more fire. We need to get used to it. We need to, in a way, embrace it. Otherwise, we're going to be miserable. The best way we can. Forest ecosystems around here are adapted to fire. Fire has many benefits to the forest, okay, to the forest. Fuels have accumulated over time due to fire exclusion and also past logging activities, okay, which is not it was a lot of this was really not management. It was just commercial logging, okay. And that fuel reduction efforts must be highly strategic and very well maintained if we want them to be effective. And so with this, I will thank you and the graduate students, which are really the engine of what we do, the undergraduate students, because they are fantastic help and they are beautiful inspiration, and of course the funding sources, and to you all. Thank you very much.
There we go. Thank you, Anna. Can you hear me? So my name is Andrew Larson. I am a forest ecologist, and I'm also trained as a forester. So I have a background both in forest management as well as in ecology, which is the science that underpins or gives us the basis for forest management. So I'm going to focus. You're going to hear a lot of similar messages from me as to what you just heard from Anna, which is great. I want to start with a refresher, if you had forgotten already what we lived through. You know, fires invaded really all aspects of our life, even here in town last summer. And the smoke in particular was oppressive and persistent and for really weeks at a time unavoidable. You know, here is a shot at Flathead Lake at Yellow Bay where you could barely see across the bay, definitely not across the lake, and at times it was like this for weeks. So even those of us who live in the city and are not out in that wildland-urban interface had to deal with fire last year. Now, since the fire season, well, really, while it was still going, as the fire season went on, we saw more and more media coverage. We saw the emergence of a lot of public debate, and I'll just show a few different headlines here that I've captured that try to get that. So you see in the headline here, finger pointing and debate. So we're starting to get some controversies back in September. By later in the month, Montana was in the national news and the wildfires here. And again, this emphasis on debate and what's the relationship between wildfires and logging. When you go to the opinion pages, that's where things get most polarized, and we see things like this statement, lack of logging worsened wildfires, and we can find almost the exact opposite statement. Logging isn't the solution to our wildfire problem. So the question that we're confronted with is, what's the balance? Where is the truth? What does our current scientific understanding say about these different perspectives. And I'm going to try and give you at least my take on that tonight. I'm going to start with my last slide. So if you fall asleep or if I make you mad, you at least will have heard my main point. So forest management, including commercial logging, has an important role to play in helping humans coexist with wildfire. And that's a very carefully constructed statement. I'm not making you very many promises there. But there's some big caveats, and these are oftentimes the things that get left out of the news articles, or sometimes they're actually the report. I'm going to take a cheap shot at reporters here. The reporters will craft questions that make you forget to say the but and the caveat. Forest management is not going to prevent fires or eliminate smoke. So we have to be, I think, very careful about what we promise and what we expect. The number one most important driver of wildfire activity in our part of the world is year-to-year climate variation. So if you go from Montana to the Pacific Ocean, down into Northern California, up into southern British Columbia, the main thing that determines whether it's a big fire year or not is summer weather. Spring weather is a factor as well, but summer weather is the big one. If it's hot and dry, we have big fires. And if you think about it, we have a lot of fuel on the landscape. That's a forested part of the world. And so the fuel is there, but the fuel has to be available to burn. And in hot, dry years, it becomes available to burn. This is some great research, actually by my wife, so I had to feature it. But these two graphs here show temperature, July temperature on the x-axis, and cumulative summer precipitation on the y-axis. So up here, the top left, that's cool, wet summers. And in the lower right, these are hot, dry summers. And the size of those circles, so the circles represent the acres burned in a given year. You see all the big circles are here in the hot, dry corner, few and small circles in the cool, wet. So this is from Washington State, from the North Cascades. And I picked that on purpose because we have to, in Missoula, be aware of what's going on upwind from us. In Washington, Oregon, California, and especially Canada, send us smoke all summer long. It's not just what we produce locally, it's what everybody to the west is doing as well. So the same principles for climate, though, hold throughout this whole big northwestern and northern Rockies region. So given the overriding importance of climate, we need to come back to the forest management question and say, is forest management, can we have an effect? And I'll tell you, yes, we can. And we need to refine that and say, okay, where and how can forest management influence wildfires? And what does the science say about activities before fires? Where is it appropriate? Where is it justified? Anna's given you a lot of insight into that already. The place where we have the strongest evidence, the strongest scientific basis to do this sort of forest management work are in our lower elevation forests. These are forests that historically burned frequently. So they're places where you would have, on average, many years with relatively dry conditions where those fuels become available to burn. And importantly, these forests have an abundance of the tree species that are adapted to resist fire. Excuse me. The poster child of this are the ponderosa pine forests. This is the most sort of charismatic and widespread. It's not just pure pine forest, though. If you move up the hill just a little bit into what I call the inland northwest mixed conifer forest, where you have some western larch and some Douglas fir. In the lower end of these forests, we're in the mixed part of the mixed severity fire regime here, but where in many of these sites they experienced a history of frequent and low severity fire. I want to spend some time kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of what these forests look like and how they relate to fire. How do they function when they have a healthy relationship with fire? So I'll show you a series of drawings to begin with that try to capture their average condition, if you will. And They're often dominated by old trees, but usually with the whole age range of ages present. Everything from seedlings to trees that are several centuries old, but they're at low density, widely spaced, multiple age classes. They're patchy, it's a noisy forest, and there's relatively low fuel accumulations on the surface. And so that condition is created by fire, and it perpetuates that frequent fire regime. So when a fire event occurs, the fuel loads are low enough that the forest tends to stay, or excuse me, the fire tends to stay on the forest floor, and the majority of the large trees are not consumed. Occasionally you'll have a torching event where the fire makes it off the forest floor into the canopy of a big tree. But through time, you have a sort of a shifting mosaic, but where the overall picture is maintained. So fire's doing a number of things here. It's thinning the small trees, it's selectively removing the fire-sensitive species, it's consuming surface fuels, it's keeping the crowns of the big trees, the live trees, up high so that they don't catch fire from the surface fire, and that low density limits connectivity up in the canopy so that when one tree ignites, the probability of it spreading to a neighbor is relatively low. If we look, so here's an aerial view looking down into a forest with an active frequent fire regime. And you can see all these things that I've described already being expressed. There's low density, big old trees. But then the other thing that we can see is this patchy mosaic pattern where we go from areas of higher density to lower density, but then there's almost these meadows throughout. The open space is actually what dominates these forests. They typically have less than 50% canopy cover. And so when we come back to that, that open space is one of the things that got early foresters into trouble. So if you think back to the days of Gifford Pinchot, the very early days of American forestry, you had a body of knowledge that came from Central and Northern Europe, places that don't burn very often, that was brought to New England. The Yale School of Forestry was one of the first, and so our earliest professional foresters were trained in a knowledge base from forests that didn't burn very much, and then they went to school in New England, where they have wet summers. And they also, so the forests that they were trained in didn't burn very often. So when they came to the West, you look at this sort of a stand structure, and you see wasted resources. There's all this open space that could be occupied by trees. There's water below ground and nitrogen below ground that's not being fully utilized. And so the training that came from a different environment that didn't support a lot of fire led early foresters to perceive fire as an enemy, essentially, to timber production, to potential economic returns, and the full utilization of the forest. And so one of the first things that came from that, of course, was the mantra, the dogma, really, of fire suppression. So we need to remove that enemy of the forest, is how it was perceived early on. Now, there were some other things that went on that it's important to acknowledge. Another thing that was happening in the early days in our western forests was widespread domestic livestock grazing. And what happened with that, in some places, the grasses in the understory played an important role of competing with tree seedlings. They made it harder for seedlings to establish. On top of that, grass is great fuel. So if you have thousands and thousands and thousands of sheep on the landscape consuming that fine fuel, that contributes to interrupting fires. Also, those sheep are consuming the main competitor of seedlings. And so in places, intense livestock grazing led to or contributed to very successful seedling establishment, which coincided with the removal of fire. And then, of course, we cut down primarily the biggest trees that were the most resistant to fire. And Anna presented some great data on the effects of this. But so it wasn't just fire suppression, it was an intersection of multiple different activities that were going on in early forests. And the net effect was to take that open stand structure dominated by a few big old trees, and after a century, convert to something that looks like this. And in the places where the big old trees were selectively removed, well, we wouldn't even have these big ones remaining anymore. So you can see how a whole set of different activities coincided to give us this big change in fuel structure. There's a picture of 1909 in the Bitterroot Valley, 80 years later from the exact same photo point. You begin to see some of the changes that happened. You know, here we're walking through a site that's experienced that same history. And when you step outside of it, you can see the increase in connectivity of the canopy fuels, which really matters because now you have a stand structure that can carry a crown fire, something that looks like that. And there was the outcome. So forest management, we have an exceptionally strong scientific basis. People have been working on this for several decades now. We're still fine-tuning it. But there are a set of basic principles that can help us with management do work to restore a healthy, functional relationship with fire in these forests. And the set of principles comes straight from how do these forests look when they have a good relationship? What are they made of with fire? So basic principles, keep the big old trees if you have them, and focus on retaining the trees that have traits that give them resistance to fire and to drought. These are dry places. When we go and manage forests for these purposes, focus on the littlest trees that provide connectivity from the ground up into the crown. We call those ladder fuels. Whoops. Reduce overall canopy density. That just means, on average, space trees further out so that when one catches on fire, it's harder to spread. A critical point that is left out of many debates in the media and most discussions is the essential role of prescribed fire. There is a huge amount of stored energy in the surface of the forest floor, all that accumulated organic matter. We can't do anything with chainsaws or machines or thinning or logging to influence that. The only way that we really influence fuels on the forest floor is through prescribed fire. And then the fifth principle is when you implement these first four, keep this big picture, the background of the complexity, the spatial variability of the natural forest in mind. I'll give you a little bit more on that. So here's what this looks like. This is an active restoration and fuel reduction treatment going this winter right now, and they're doing a fantastic job. Here's the machine out working in the woods. They've already been through this area in the foreground, and they've left the big fire-resistant pines. Here's a stack of logs right here. They're focused on the smaller trees, on the fire-intolerant species, and they're doing a great job at implementing those first three principles we can see right here. This is a photo from the school forest, from the Lubrecht Experimental Forest. The benefits of this sort of a treatment are only going to be realized if it's followed in the next year or so with prescribed fire to treat the surface fuels, because when you go and log, you're actually creating more surface fuels. So we have 100 years of accumulation plus the new stuff that we just put on the ground that has to be taken care of. Plus, we have the added benefit of that fire contributes to overall density reduction. It selectively affects and removes the fire-sensitive species. And then here's that fifth point. As we do all of that, focus on making sure you capture the variability that we see in the natural forests. And so this picture here on the right, that's a map view. The dots represent the locations of trees. And you see we've got these great big snaky open areas. And then that's juxtaposed. We've got crazy dense clumps of trees and then these widely spaced individuals. So one of the things we have to be careful to not do is to accidentally engineer this sort of an environment here, which is very fire resistant, but it lacks the attributes of a forest stand structure that are created by fire. And why do we care about this? We care about it because a number of different ecosystem functions depend on and are regulated by these sorts of patterns, the variability. I'll give you just 3 examples. One of them that we've been working on for a number of years is how the forest canopy interacts with snow. And you see this is from a drone flight over one of our study areas in the melt season, and you can see the places where snow persists. Here we are at week 6, it's almost gone. are out in these openings, but they're openings that are next to dense areas. And it's the interaction of not having a lot of canopy in the middle of the winter when snow is accumulating, but then having a little bit of shade to the south, especially during the melt period. And you can prolong by having this spatially variable stand structure, that sort of variability. Melt can be prolonged by 2 or 3 weeks. So we get the water stored in the snowpack persisting on the site for longer, which matters then to the understory. So this is some great new work just out of Colorado, actually. I can't take credit for this. But what they have shown is that the open areas in these forests matter tremendously for understory plant diversity and abundance. And as you get out into those big openings, native understory plant cover and diversity increases. And then the big one is wildlife habitat. So when we have the complex stand structure, you have, for example, this is showing occupied nest sites of northern goshawk, and they tend to select big trees in relatively dense clumps, but then they need much more open areas with ideally contrasting spatially variable habitats to forage in, to find their prey species. And so if we go out and engineer a uniform homogeneous forest, it might be fire resistant, might be resistant to a crown fire, but we've lost some of the habitat elements. Now the fortunate thing is we can have the crown fire resistance and have the habitat features. So when we put all this together, it begins to give us a picture that's consistent with where I started. We can go from these sorts of conditions where past management and fire exclusion has created heavy fuel loads, dense stand structures, and fire behaviors that we don't like, and fire outcomes, effects we don't like, through a combination of judicious and carefully considered harvesting, followed with prescribed fire, we can restore the sort of fire regimes and fire behaviors that hopefully we can live with. Now, something that gets left out, especially in public conversations about this, is that there's still fire in this picture. And management does not prevent fire. I cannot stress that enough. And in fact, we have to be very deliberate about using fire as a tool and bringing it in on our terms. This is, I would argue, prescribed fire is one of the biggest bottlenecks we have to successful management in these forest types. So we come back to some of the places, some of the headlines that we started with. So based on what I've been talking about for the last 15 minutes, I actually see a tremendous amount of support for this. I've given you a lot of evidence that by not harvesting, we have perpetuated a wildfire problem. But remember where we started. We made this point about the overriding importance of year-to-year climate variability in controlling regional wildfire. And it's those drought years that really drive things. And the reason that's so important is in these extreme dry years, our high elevation forests, the mountain forests, become available to burn. And those are the places where, one, because they're primarily populated with fire-sensitive trees, that when they're exposed to even moderate fires, they die. That's their strategy. We don't have a real basis to go in and manipulate them in order to restore them in the way or manage their fuels in the way that I've been describing. And they naturally burn infrequently, and they naturally accumulate heavy fuel loads. So with that in mind, it's very easy to go and find evidence to support this sort of a statement. So who's right? I think that when we look at it, they're all a little bit right. We can find evidence that will support both these statements, but they're all a little bit wrong. And oftentimes, it's the information that gets left out that I think is most important. We have a tendency to reduce the complexity of an issue like wildfires and forest management down to simple statements, selectively supported sometimes, and we lose sight of the big picture. So to come back, here's my final slide. Forest management, we have, I'll say we, as a forester, we have things that we can do to help. I'm so excited for the students that we train. I'm also concerned about their future because it's really important that we don't send them out with expectations that they can't meet. And so I have to defend my profession and our students to a certain degree and make sure that they know and that you know that they have a lot to offer, but they can't solve the entire problem. And it's going to take actions and changes in behaviors outside of the forest to really live with wildfire. And so while we have a very important role to play in forest management, fire is inevitable. It's not preventable. Number one thing, we cannot prevent it. We have to learn to live with it. Two, don't forget the droughts. That's the number one thing. And three, we need to prepare in our homes, in our cities, well away from the forest, for more fire and more smoke. So we can't put it all on the foresters and the fire ecologists. They have a role to play, we have a role to play, but they're not a silver bullet. So that's all I've got. But hopefully now we can have some discussion. I think that's the part that I've been looking forward to.
Great. We'll have microphones on either side of the auditorium, and when you have a question, if you will address it to one or the other of our speakers, or both, but make sure that we get a microphone to you.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yes. Oh.
Hi. I guess I was caught with your comment about the Forest Service students, the forestry students at the university. Are they going to turn out to be forestry managers? And I guess what my question is where does the harvesting of timber for the housing industry come from? Does it come from the forests that the federal government owns, or is it going to come eventually exclusively from the private timber companies?
That's a good question. The current answer is there's some of both. The federal estates, the federal forests, do contribute a portion to wood products manufacturing. It's relatively small, especially here in the Northern Rockies, and that's been a major issue for a number of years now, that of concern to the industry in particular. You know, I was at a public presentation recently and saw some great numbers cited about the mismatch between mill capacity and available log supply. So, but on the other hand, there is some modest amount of wood coming from the federal forest still. I can't say, the part of your question about the future and what's that going to hold, I don't know.
Well, I think what it almost sounded like you were saying, and I know you didn't say this, but it was like you were saying today's forestry students will become the gardeners of our forests.
Oh, no, I don't mean to say that at all.
Okay.
No. What I was trying to get across there at the end, when I mentioned the students that we're training now, I have to make sure that we're not making promises that our students can't keep. And I can't even count the number of times I've been asked this fall about the issue of forest management and wildfire, and why doesn't logging and forest management prevent these fires and this smoke? And that's a fundamental misconception that I've been trying to address, and it's something that I want to make sure that us, broader society, doesn't expect of our forestry students, because it's not something that our profession can deliver on.
Okay. Can I ask Anna a question?
Sure.
Anna, I liked your graphs at the front. Have you along the way also measured like a change in the length of the forest fire season over the last 50 years, like from the mid-70s to now?
I personally have not, but it's something that has been measured a lot, and we know that it has increased. So our measurements, what they tell us is that denser stands get to become better fuels earlier, so it does extend the fire season. But we've not measured it directly across the landscape to see the lengthening of the fire season. Is that what you were
So if
asking?
somebody says the forest season over the last 20 years has gone up 50%, where are they getting that information?
So the lengthening of the fire season, so information comes from different sources. Climate sources is one, and when temperatures start rising, and in the spring, and over the fall. So, and that's actually a very good question. So the climate factor is number one, as we've tried to stress. So it's when it's hotter and drier, and it's getting hotter and drier for a longer period. And so that alone lengthens the fire season. So climate data alone can tell us the conditions that are prime for ignitions and burning occur over a longer time relative to before. Our work, which is very much physiological, if you want, shows that yes, trees in denser stands get drier earlier, so have less water and they're crispier earlier. So that means that the probability of ignition might occur earlier too in this forest. Yeah.
Got one here.
So actually, I was thinking about trying to answer the lengthening fire season question, which is that question about the energy release component, which is what firefighters use to decide when fire behaviors can become extreme. And what they've seen is that over the last 20 to 25 years, that period of time when energy release component's above 90 is occurring more frequently almost year over year for the last 15 to 20 years. So that's that longer time period when fuels are conditioned to burn for longer periods of the year than they have in the past. Sorry, so that's going into that question. I had a question actually for you, Andrew, and I'm thinking about the cost involved with what used to be a profitable forest industry. The federal government used to sell its forests to private industry to harvest them. And then just thinking of the upfront cost of doing things like these thinning and burning treatments. I know there's the Forest Restoration Initiative in Arizona that's attempting to recuperate some of those costs of all of these thinning treatments. Can you speak to that a little bit more in the Northern Rockies and what the costs are of doing these types of treatments?
Well, I'm not going to be able to give you numbers, but I absolutely can agree that they are expensive. Oftentimes, the material, while it might be merchantable, that needs to be removed to achieve the sorts of things that I showed you graphics of, it's not often is there enough value to even pay for the treatment. And so part of it, I think, though, is what's the time scale with which we're going to address that cost question? So especially in places where we've previously harvested the largest and most valuable trees, we or our older generations have derived some benefit from the capital that was embodied by that stumpage, those trees that were growing there that we chose to harvest. And so now we're faced with a period of reinvestment in a lot of places, in a lot of cases. Now, it's highly, and this is where I can't give you specifics because I'm not a harvest engineer. I don't do timber sale planning on a day-to-day basis. But I can tell you that it's widely variable from place to place. It's going to depend on what's the specific condition of the forest you're treating, what markets are available to you. Do you have mills nearby, or do you have to haul hundreds of miles to get to the nearest market? And then we're also subject to a number of bigger picture factors that we really can't control at the scale of a forest landowner or even the scale of national forest system. Things like tariffs and import-export dynamics. So, changing the regulatory environment or the relationship with softwood import from Canada, for example, is going to influence local and regional markets. Similarly, global market forces and the supply of fiber out of the southern hemisphere is going to influence, to a certain degree, the price that you can get and the sort of markets that you have available locally. So the economics are intractable, they are difficult, and I don't see it getting much easier. But when I take a really long view, I see, especially in our western forests, I see a lot of them being in basically a period, we're in a period where it's time for us to reinvest after a long period where we've been able to extract and derive some of those economic benefits, values, from the historical growth and accumulation of those large diameter trees in the past.
I have a question for Professor Sala. It seems to me, unless I misunderstood, right here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Unless I misunderstood you, it seems that you're perpetuating a set of, what do I want to say, wrong concepts about lodgepole pine. When you were saying that lodgepole pine depended on fire for regeneration and so forth. And that's not strictly true. The frequency of serotiny in lodgepole pine stands varies across the landscape. Some stands have very few serotinous cones. They reproduce without fire or anything else of the sort. Other stands have quite a few serotinous cones. They will reproduce better after fire. But another misunderstanding is that the serotinous cones do not need fire to open. All they need is a temperature of somewhere around 115 degrees. And they can get that if the needles that are shading them are taken away, or if they are growing on road banks where there's a great deal of reflected heat from the soil and so forth. So lodgepole pine's a lot more complicated than just saying that it requires fire.
I appreciate this, and I did mention, and you're absolutely right, I did mention some varieties of of lodgepole pine, so not all lodgepole pine cones are serotinous. There is substantial research, however, and showing, for instance, in boreal species, some do require fire, so the temperatures, these high temperatures are the research is suggesting, I've not done this research, but other people have, the research is suggesting that the adaptation to open or release seeds, because it doesn't happen only in coniferous species. In Australia, for instance, on Banksia have these mechanisms by which they will release seed under the heat. And so there is research showing that, yes, it can get hot without fire, but that this type of strategy has evolved as a result of fires, so that when different species in different continents that show the same strategy, it shows that it has evolved in response to fire. Doesn't mean that they cannot open under some other extreme conditions, but you're very right. So that lodgepole pine can regenerate without fire. So, that's a very good clarification. Thank you.
My name is Craig. I have a question for Andrew, possibly a couple. Right here. So I grew up in a logging family. My dad was a sawyer, and I could see through experience, that for them, some of the most aggressive times of the year for logging was in the winter, when the ground was frozen and they could operate their equipment much more aggressively without tearing up the ground, so to speak. And one of the common things that they did was brush piling. So there was kind of an approach to the logging where they would actually clean up the area with the equipment, pile it into large brush piles, and then basically light it on fire during the winter with diesel fuel and let it burn all winter long. And I'm assuming you're familiar with that practice, and would ask you to maybe compare, contrast that a little bit with your presentation on doing the work in the summer and fall, and then the prescribed burns the following spring, where those two may either be common or where one is is advantageous over the other. And then with either case, with the ongoing prevalence of fire continuing throughout, what, as people living in a community with smoke, what can we expect to see if a better or more proper job of prescribed burning is done, as opposed to, like the Roaring Creek fire and the devastation that it left? Is it going to be a much milder, more tolerable level of smoke, or how would you project that?
So I'll answer your first question first, and I'll go back to this photo right here and say that winter logging, like this project that's going right now, is that back up? Good. So there's 18 inches or more snow on the ground, and the ground presumably is relatively frozen underneath. And the forester that was running this sale put off starting another bigger project in January. The logger was able to move in, start a new project, but the warm period of weather we had in January had made the roads and the soil surface so wet that it wasn't appropriate to move in and go ahead and start logging. I don't know if they've changed that now. We've got this cold spell with additional snow back on the ground. So absolutely agree with that, and you're right on. I haven't encountered the practice of burning in the winter. I was trained out on the coast in western Washington, and a lot of times the big piles would get burned in the winter, or it kind of rains all the time out there. But the practice there, in a lot of places, is this giant slash pile, and they throw a chunk of brown paper up on top of it, and there's enough interception of the moisture with that paper that leaves the center just dry enough that it'll carry fire. And during the wet period, you see a lot of those piles get burned. I think this fall, although I don't know if there was any snow on the ground yet, I think the Forest Service burned a whole bunch of piles up in the upper Rattlesnake. I don't know if it gets quite to the scenario you were talking about there. Prescribed burning is, I have to be careful here because I'm not a prescribed, I've only carried a drip torch around a couple of times. But there are a few things that we try to sort of be mindful of. So one of the big challenges in the Northern Rockies is we have relatively small windows in the spring and fall where the conditions are dry enough to carry fire and get the effects and the consumption that we're looking for, but where the risk is low enough that probability of escape or high severity effects is not so great. So it is a challenge, and the timing and the complexity that comes with that, combined with a relatively small workforce of trained people who have the expertise to accomplish that, combined with other things like air quality and the regulatory environment, all work together to constrain the use of prescribed fire. Now, on your smoke question, there's plenty of good data. I can't give you a specific figure that shows that the characteristics of smoke typical of prescribed fires differ from, let me see if I can find a good picture of it. these sort of mega events. But there's a lot of things going on here. We're burning different fuel beds. You're burning under different conditions. The duration of the event is going to differ. Broadly speaking, prescribed fire, smoke is more benign. But someone with a health background may have a very different perspective from me. One of the things that's so frustrating, though, despite everything I said about the importance of using prescribed fire and the success that we can have with the combination of harvest and fire, we still are going to have that. And so it gets to be a hard thing to tell people. It's like, well, I want to burn more. I think it's the right thing to do to steward many of our forests as a natural resource manager. But it most of the time is actually going to represent an extra increment of smoke. We're still going to have this. So that's what led me back to some of the closing things that I said, that we have to, I think, change our mindset. The smoke is not going to go away, and we have to start thinking about how do we build our homes. I mean, I think about my daughter. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I tell you what, we're going to make sure that the air filter is up to snuff at her preschool next summer. I mean, I've had just a tremendous amount of guilt and stress over that all through the fall and winter, thinking of the exposure that she had last summer. And there's nothing that we can ask foresters, the Forest Service, forest industry. We can't pin that blame on them. It's just the world we live in. So that's why I say I think we've got practices we can do in the woods, but we got to think about our homes and our workplaces as well. And that's where we can really adapt and do things to improve the wildfire problem.
I think we have time for just one more question. And back there.
Hi, thank you. I just want to say I've already learned so much tonight. And I'm a geologist, so I'm very ignorant as to trees. I have a question for either of you or both of you. When it comes to forest stands that are, majority are dead, I could only assume to beetle kill. Specifically, I'm thinking around McDonald Pass and Helena. Every time I go through there, I just can't believe it hasn't caught on fire yet. What would be the approach to large stands that are just high density, dead trees? Would you prescribe winter burnings? Would you prescribe logging? Just how would we approach that? Or is it just kind of wait for the inevitable?
I'll take a shot and hand it off.
Thank you.
So that is, like most things in forestry, it's incredibly complex, and there's lots of different ways we could answer that. And part of it's going to come back to what are the management objectives for that forest. And so one landowner might choose to do nothing. They may look at that and say, my objectives are best met by doing nothing. Another landowner, as soon as those trees started to die, their objectives may be best met by moving in and immediately harvesting them and taking them to the mill before they lose value. So a couple of principles to kind of help make sense of situations like that. One, dead trees are an essential part of a healthy forest. They are critical habitat. So when you have a forest with no dead trees, you haven't got all the parts that the wildlife especially need. However, you can have more than maybe you need given some of your objectives. So there's a lot of strong basis to go and harvest some of them, especially if you're a landowner that's trying to make a living and have some economic return. So no simple answer for you there. It's going to be a little bit context dependent, but don't lose sight that some of those dead trees have value for the other things that live in the forest.
So this is not the type of research that I do, but I would say from reading the scientific literature, I think the jury is still out as to whether beetle-killed forests are more prone to, so that whether we should expect more fires because of beetle-killed forests. So there are contradictory results, and again, this gets very complex because it depends on the weather of the particular summer, and we probably need more data, etc. But what I said before, some birds do capitalize on these dead trees, and when there's a lot of beetles around, they will eat the larvae and of other type of beetles. So it's good, as Andrew said, to have dead trees, because then the birds then eat those beetles. Sometimes the logging, and this might happen with other type of beetles, the removal of these trees is too late, and it happens after the beetles have emerged. So sometimes it doesn't do anything. So yes, it is a difficult thing. Just one more comment about the cost that you were alluding before. Again, this is another a tremendously complex picture, but the cost of firefighting right now are about 50% of the entire Forest Service budget. And they've increased from about 16% in the 90s to over 50 now. That's a lot of money that is just going to firefighting. And 90% of this, over 90, is saving structures. So, I think that we, as people that live with fire and will have to live with fire, it is worth thinking about how we could spend this money in more productive ways, and what could we do to not be putting off fires all the time, saving structures, and do a management that prevents in the first place to have these structures. So I think it requires higher level thinking and planning. But
Well, I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you to Andrew and to Anna for being here. Next week, 7 o'clock, we'll start it up again and we'll get moving. Again, the next 2 lectures will be on forest-related issues and fire. So this is just the first bite. There's more to come. Thank you all for being here.